Okay, it's recording, and if everyone is ready, I'm going to let everybody in. Gabby, can I ask you a favor? We've officially started. If you see people in the waiting room, would you admit them for me, please?
Yeah.
I might miss them because I'm talking or doing something else. Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to you all. It's a pleasure for us to be hosting the launch of the Regina Twala Digital Archive. And we are very lucky to have with us today Joel Cabrita, who led this project. Joel is a professor of African history at Stanford University and the author of Written Out, The Silencing of Regina Twala. We also have Azizo da Fonseca. Azizo is the manager of digitalization services at Wits, and he oversaw the digitization of documents in the archive. We are also going to hear from Athambile Masola, who's a senior lecturer at the history department at UCT. And she's one of the co-editors of the recently published book, Inyathi Ibuzwa Kwabaphambili, Theorising South African Women's Intellectual Legacies. And finally, we've got Annie Davenish from the Wits History Department. Annie's research and publications focus on gender and activism. And she's the author of Debating Women's Citizenship in India, 1930 to 1960. So each of our speakers will speak for about 10 minutes, and after that, we are going to be opening it up for questions and comments. I'm going to also put links to both the Stanford website of the Digital Archive and the Wits Historical Papers Atom page, where you can also search the entire physical archive. But yeah, once again, welcome everyone, and I think it's over to you, Joel.
Hi, yes, thank you, Ariana. As Ariana said, my name is Joel Cabrita. I teach African history at Stanford University, and I've been one of the project leads for the digitization of the Twala papers. And I wanted to just begin by saying that although Stanford hosts the digitization project, the Twala family's wish was that the actual physical copies of the letters, the paper archive, yes, sorry, I was just saying to Ariana, I'm in London for the week. I usually live in California, and my 2-year-old is with me, and my childcare plan is gone. So the physical copy for the archives is at Wits University, Wits Historical Papers. So that's where you can access the papers should you want to, should you want to work with actual documents. So the inspiration for the archive, really came about because some years ago I wrote a book about Regina Twala. I wrote her biography. And the inspiration for the biography was the extraordinary amount of letters that Twala had exchanged, primarily with her husband, Dan Twala, over a 30-year period from the mid-30s, pretty much until her death in the late 60s. So it's a 30-year archive, remarkable it's in longevity, remarkable in its volume. There's nearly 1,000 items in the archive. And I think remarkable in the kind of caliber, the experience, and the sort of life situation of the two main protagonists of the archive. Regina and Dan were extraordinarily talented, prominent individuals in mid-20th century South Africa and later Eswatini. Twala was only the second Black woman to ever graduate from Wits. She was a published anthropologist. She was a social worker. She was a politician. Dan Twala was very active in Johannesburg sports. He was the manager of the Bantu Sports Club for many years, and a radio personality as well. So it's an extraordinary archive. It's a love letter archive on one level. It documents the sort of the rise and the decline of the Twalas' relationship in often, very intimate detail, which is one of the issues that, I, in collaboration with the family, negotiated about what they were comfortable having open for research and public consumption. Not all of the items have been open for public view as of yet. But it's also a political, social, and cultural record of primarily a city, Johannesburg. That's where Twala was based for most of the time that the archive covers. And certainly the densest, most voluminous bit of the archive are focused on the 20 years that she lived in Johannesburg from the mid-30s to the mid-50s. So it's also the chronicle and the archive of a city, that saw certainly racial segregation, but then the hardening of that in late 1948, and the kind of increasing push of the Black population out of the city. So I thought what I might do, I've just got a few minutes, is actually just show you some examples from the archive and some of the ways that through the digital collaboration with Stanford, we tried to make it not just an archive, not just a sort of dump of hundreds and hundreds of documents, and of course I shouldn't forget the photographs, but also a kind of curated tour or journey through highlights of the archive. And I think Ariana's going to share her page. Oh, and before I go any further, of course, just thank you so much to Ariana, colleagues at Wits, for hosting this event and collaborating with me. And, of course, my deepest thanks to Gabi Mohala and Azizo Defanesca at Wits Historical Papers and the Wits Digitization Center. And we'll be hearing from them shortly. And there are the logos. So, one of the things that I really wanted to kind of pull out or highlight in the archive was just the spatial story that it told about a very particular era in the cultural life of Johannesburg, which seemed to me almost akin to kind of a Harlem Renaissance moment, just in terms of the vibrancy, the liveliness, the richness of the cultural scene. So you can, if you navigate to this page, you can see the complete archive. And I think if you go to browse, you can kind of pull up everything by year. But if you go to Johannesburg Spaces, you're kind of presented with a few of the main sites that the Twalas lived and worked in, and sites which their letters are extensively preoccupied with. So maybe the Bantu Sports Club is a good one to start, where Dan Twala was the manager for many years. And what we've done is sort of try to give a brief narrative description of this place, show a few images from the archive. There you see a photograph of Dan himself, probably from the mid-30s, by the sporting grounds of the club. Regina, who was a very talented, kind of dedicated tennis player, there's her in her tennis whites. And then at the bottom of each of these pages, we've given a tab that will take you both to the letters in the archive that deal with that institution, as well as to the photographs. And you'll see there are 41 letters. So the sports club, occupied a lot of the mental space and kind of creative energy, given their professional links to it. Another example is, much, much briefer. Ariane, if you just navigate to Non-European Hospital, which is also under Johannesburg Spaces at the top, you'll see there a sort of historic photograph of the hospital from, a bit early, but roughly this period. And by contrast, you'll see there's actually just 5 letters to do with hospital. And Twala's life intersected with the hospital, and that she was admitted for a surgery in the late 1930s. spent a period of time there. And she also, when she worked as a social worker, she would refer a lot of her clients to the non-European hospital. So this is a much more kind of fragmentary, fleeting institution that appears in that archive, but is, really important for her, and I think for historians nonetheless. I think the sort of longer term goal that I'm continuing to work towards with some Stanford collaborators is creating a more ambitious map of Johannesburg that the letters yield. So, as you can see under Johannesburg Spaces, we've mined kind of about 5 sites that the letters really deal, but there are dozens, potentially hundreds more street names, stores, restaurants, neighborhoods, cultural associations, clubs, Christian groups that the Twalas kind of refer to, sometimes return to repeatedly, sometimes just refer to once or twice in passing. And a sort of longer term with the letters is to really mine them much more intensively, to kind of geomap this mid-century picture of Johannesburg that they offer. But, I think one thing I really want to reiterate is that this is just one story that this archive yields. I mean, you can tell the story of the changing city and the encroachment of sort of segregation in the city through the archive, but you could equally tell a history of intimacy, sexuality, marriage, and divorce through the archive. You could equally tell a history of, the role of women in liberation movements, both in South Africa, neighboring Eswatini. You could tell a history about culture, leisure, sports in Johannesburg. So the hope is that by opening up this archive and making it available for public consumption and use in, hopefully a user-friendly, intuitive, accessible way, it will enable new histories of Johannesburg, South Africa, and Eswatini to be told from the perspective of an archive that I think is really remarkable and really unique. And before I pass over to my colleagues to hear their kind of reflections on the archive and the project, and in the case of Aziza and Gabi, the role that they've played in making it happen, I did just want to acknowledge the generosity of the Twala family, particularly Regina's granddaughter, Inyathi Twala, who is the rights holder for all these materials, and who has, from the very beginning been completely committed to the vision of opening up her grandmother's, both really, her grandmother and her grandfather's life, legacy, work, and writing to the general public. So we're really profoundly grateful to the Twala family. So Ariana, I think you can stop the share, and I will hand over, I think, to Aziza.
Thanks, Joelle. Let me see. Here's Aziza. We still can't hear you, Aziza. Let me.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us and being part of this launch.
You get an echo. I don't know if it's from Gabi's computer next to you.
Okay, let me just mute. Yeah. Is that better?
Yeah. Yes, perfect.
Can
Thanks.
you hear it? Okay. Well, thank you very much once again to all colleagues. I mean, from the Wits digitization side, I think one important aspect of this project was that when we started dealing with the digitization of these letters, it became quite clear that it wasn't just another case of a digitization project that had to be dealt with just as a normal project. And I started getting a sense of the importance of the data when I started dealing with Joelle in meetings that we had with her and her team, the sort of the importance of the content of the letters and who this person was, and the person that we deal as Regina Twala. And I think it almost became a sort of an archaeological dig for us as a DG Center, because we started dealing with the digitization of these letters as similarly as unearthing an archaeological object, because the content that we had to tease out became so important at a later stage that the team were able to also tease out sort of the content in terms of what the relationships were, what sort of dates we were able to infer from the letters, the relationships between the different elements that were appearing in the letters. And I think all of that also came in as part of what Joel was saying, is that when we dealt with the when we got from historical papers, were the letters that had been already inventorized in one manner. But then we had discovered that as well, there was another aspect of the inventory that had taken place prior to them arriving at the historical papers. So then we started figuring out that actually a lot of these elements of these letters were going to become important to tease out information at a later stage. And I think in my discussion with Joel was to say, I mean, we've got other elements of these letters that indicate something that we're actually not quite aware what they might be. But I think it would be important for us to tease them out and present them in a very concise spreadsheet that we created for the team. So as we started working, it's really, again, this metaphor of unearthing an archaeological artifact, which then we started interpreting and creating the links that allowed us to actually engage with Joel and the team, and gave us a sense of who was Regina. And I think it was an important part for us, because we had not actually engaged in such a manner with other aspects of digitization. We were really consumed by what the importance of this project for Joel, and then we paid meticulous attention to these details. And I think from us was obviously a learning curve on who Regina was, what was her importance in the landscape, because she was almost forgotten. If again, as an archaeological artifact, it's almost like been obliterated from history. And I think these letters showcase her relevance in the intellectual landscape. And I think for us, that was one of the most important aspects of it, not just as a technical team that just digitized, but I think just imbued ourselves in the importance of the content and working with the content in a very meticulous way. So I think if you allow me also, I can just share with you what, okay. So give us a share. Yeah, and I think that's what I can say. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Azizo. Thanks, Joel and Azizo, for giving us this introduction to the archive. Gabi, was there anything else you wanted to mention in terms of the Wits archive?
Yes, good afternoon. Let me just share.
I need Azizo to mute.
Azizo's going out, yes. Let me just share this, the actual archive. So that's quite different from Joel's side. It's an archival tool, and it gives you basically the information about the collection that we have at Wits. And it also gives you a little bit of background on the collection. It also gives you a link to Stanford. What I also want to just maybe show you is it lists all these letters, because as Joel pointed out, there's a lot of personal information involved here. So if you do want to get some sense, at least what's covered, Azizo's colleagues have listed dates, and where possible have listed some content. So all these letters are kind of listed here, and that is on the archive site of this of the Regina Twala letter collection.
Thank you, Gabi. Did you post the Atom link as well? Could you please post it when you get a chance in the chat, so that participant can save that link as well? Thanks a lot. We're now going to move on to Athambile and Annie, who are our discussants, for them to give us their impressions and comments on the archive, and then, we'll give Joel a chance to respond to these comments before we open it up to the audience. Over to you, Athambile, and thanks very much again for being part of this.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for inviting me and for being part of this conversation, and congratulations to the team. My comments are just going to be as someone who used it. I'm just going to reflect on that process, actually, of encountering the archive and the things that I found quite interesting. But just to say to Joel, I'm so relieved when that you said that, not all the letters have been shared, because my immediate response was, oh, that tension of like when the private becomes public and the decisions that are made for who deserves privacy and who doesn't, and what are our ethics as researchers around some of that. So, and I think it is important to maintain some of that privacy for however long, and obviously having the family involved in some of that is very important. So that's a relief, because I don't think archives are necessarily should be a tell-all, but that's just me. And so, okay, let me just speak in relation to the order, and perhaps that's why the letters, the love letters, are so there's like such a tenderness to them. It's like I always feel bad when I read people's love letters from archives. I mean, they're beautiful and they're lovely, but I'm still struggling with like feeling like a voyeur. But the interesting thing here, I guess, is that the love letters here are like laced with so much struggle and work and hope and aspirations. And I wondered if, and I can't remember if you spoke about, or you write about this, or kind of refer to this in the book, Joel, about like their own awareness that somehow one day they almost write as people who their letters will be read. And I really got that sense, because when I was reading the book, I didn't get a sense of that, but now I understand if you did mention that, and I feel like somewhere in the back of my mind, I definitely got that sense. And I mean, now it kind of gives us a character of the significance of their public lives, but as well as their private lives. But I got a sense of that. Oh, these two have a sense of these things must be kept for the future. So, I mean, if you're reading in between the lines, you can see that quite immediately. And maybe I should have started with this. I was so struck by the acknowledgements page, and the acknowledgements page as being a kind of a circulation of this work. Here's this woman from Johannesburg, but her writing all these years later is connecting all these other people in all these other parts of the world. I just found it such an interesting thing about that, what the archive can do in terms of circulation, in terms of space, in terms of time. And yeah, and I think being upfront about like this idea that it is a South African archive in the sense, but it's taken all these partnerships to make it possible. So I guess those are the perks of research collaborations, that an archival project can sit in one place, but it actually requires so many other threads in order for it to come alive. And then I noticed just the organization of the archive, and obviously there are many ways in which you can navigate it. You can navigate it through the top, or you can navigate it through the side. And I found myself navigating it through the side and noticing that even that kind of organization, I mean, I don't think this is unusual for many digital archives, but how even just the organization tells a story. So for example, I think like 1938 has 196 sources just in that year alone. And that tells you so much. And then by 1939, there are 96 sources. And obviously there've been choices that have been made there, but just watching the kind of the dwindling numbers, what was happening in each year, you know, that can give us some kind of patterns. With it, like there's a decrease all the way to 1948 when there are only 3 sources under 1948. And I think the placemaking as well that you choose in the organization, again, Johannesburg, I think it has 128 sources. and kind of decreases depending. And that one is the most interesting, I guess, for me in terms of mobility, because you also get a sense of her letters and all the images and how far reaching they were in terms of geographical space. And then I just found myself, I think the last section that I checked was the language tab, that English has 491 sources and isiZulu has 178 sources, and what that also tells us about, I guess, a circulation, but about how language is very much at the heart of how we can access the archive. And then, of course, the gaps that you point out immediately, you know, the fact that only the manuscript exists. And when I didn't go onto the Atom link, actually, which is great to know that there's a collaboration or like a connection, because it's almost like students would then have to look at the Stanford website and look at the Atom website and visit the historical archives, and those three experiences, kind of a triangulation of the archive in a sense, the three different experiences that they can have, and noticing some of the gaps that are already declared, and in any other gaps. And I guess the most obvious one that is mentioned is the manuscript. There's only one manuscript that exists. So yeah, I mean, I'm very excited about this in terms of how useful it will be, not only for us as researchers, but also for our students. I think there are very few digital archives solely dedicated to Black women. I don't know how many there are actually. So I stand to be corrected, but if this is a first, this is even better. And I think there's a kind of excitement or a nudge in terms of thinking about what do we do with the other. I mean, I know there's been work on a collection of archives into like the magazines that Asanda Sizani has been doing, which is a different kind of, not digitization as such, but a different kind of refiguring of the archive into different mediums. So this kind of refiguring as well, particularly in relation to Black women, is quite something. I mean, it would also be quite interesting to trace what has happened in the last 5 years, or even your own, the time, Joel, that you've been working on this, from when you first found her and where you are now. I'm just also curious about the number of years. Could we make an average of how many years does it take for someone to go from obscurity to visibility in this case? I mean, I'm thinking of the Noni example for my kind of never have been able to find her books to the book of her columns. That's like a 10 to 15 year gap. I'd be curious what was the kind of start to finish. Because then we can just say, like, it takes 15 years for a Black woman to come back into circulation, if we want to make that kind of statement. But I'm just curious for myself. And I think making a statement about the number of years that it actually takes is to also then acknowledge the labor that goes into someone's name not being ungoogleable to an archive existing about them, which is the case with many of the people that we do research on. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Athambile. I'm going to hand over to Annie.
Great, thanks, Ariana. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Joel, I went to your book launch. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before. And it's been a delight to learn more about Regina Twala and to explore this wonderful archive. We've seen an archival turn in scholarship in recent years, and a new interest in archives based on an understanding, of course, that they are not merely neutral repositories where documents are stored, but that they are in fact expressions and instruments of power, precisely because they are sites of knowledge production. And this understanding, of course, extends not only to the presence of archives, their contents and form, but also the very means by which they come into existence or not. In the words of Mbembe, of course, we often forget that not all documents are destined to be archives. In any given cultural system, only some documents fulfill the criteria of archivability. In the case of Regina Twala, I think the launch of this online open access digital archive, following on from your book publication, Joelle, makes a critical intervention. As you emphasized in your book, when you began doing this research, you say nearly every historian of Southern Africa who I spoke to about these letters, which of course are the heart of the archive, simply had no idea about Twala's existence. More than that, I think you argue that in some respects there has been a deliberate writing out of Twala's work and legacy. And of course, this was partly due to the fact that you had the Swedish historian, or I think it was anthropologist rather, I'm not sure, who had relied heavily on Twala to conduct their research and fieldwork, and had drawn on Twala's own analysis and intellectual labor and failed to acknowledge this in their publications, a form of clear intellectual theft. So, of course, no one knew about Twala because the documentation of her life and work had either been usurped in the case of this collaboration, or hidden, as her private letters at this time were gathering dust sitting in the private space of historian Tim Cozen's home, or destroyed in the case of her book manuscripts. Other sources, such as her and Dan's life together, the photographs, were scattered in private collections. So there was no visibility of Twala in the public sphere. So Jana Smith-Elford and Michelle Meager emphasize that insofar as archives exist as official structures of knowledge, there are political and epistemological projects by collating and assembling a body of sources that were hidden and dispersed before, with a large part of this invisibility connected to Twala's political, social, and economic marginalization as a Black African woman. And by placing them in a historical context in the public sphere, you can, in a sense, think of this archive as an act of restoration or justice. It provides an invaluable resource for researchers and scholars and activists to work on Regina Twala, and hence contributes to making her visible and writing her back into history. I think this is particularly important and significant in the context of South Africa, where there's been a lot of interest and discussion and debate and disagreement about the role of the archive in processes of decolonization and transformation. Equally importantly, I think this archive makes an important feminist intervention as well. Archival, once again, as Elford and Michelle Meager emphasize, archival collections can be valuable resources for feminist history, literary studies, and other scholarly and activist projects that center the recovery of lost voices and contribute to the recuperation of women's participation in society, and set out to reimagine the past. While acknowledging the limits of digitized archives, and we know they require access to technology, a power supply, and internet connection, which are not always readily available in places in the global South, they simultaneously expand the reach of these sources to scholars and researchers all over the world. So they enable not only a kind of visibility, but also a kind of democratization, which I think is important. Just to say, I've so enjoyed wandering and exploring my way through this archive over the past few days. And I think its contribution lies not only in making visible, but also in the enormous richness of the sources it presents. So I think this richness of the archive is evident in a number of different ways, which I just want to touch on briefly. Firstly, I really enjoyed the inclusion of the Johannesburg spaces section, which you spoke about, Joelle. And I think this component of the archive, as you already stressed, really places Regina and Dan Twala in the social and geopolitical context of Johannesburg in the 30s and 40s, and also highlights the sort of rich associational and cultural life that they were part of. So there's almost a mini archive of this rich cultural and association life within this bigger archive. Secondly, as you also already mentioned, Joelle, I think the richness of this archive is evident in the extensive time period that the body of letters between Regina and Dan Twala covers, reaching from 1938 to 1963. And this really allows us to track the evolution of their personal relationship, but also the development of their intellectual ideas and consciousness. So it provides scope to track process, change, and continuity over time. Now, we know that letters and other forms of private and unpublished writing are really important sources for writing women's and feminist histories, often when there are not other kinds of source materials available. At the same time, however, letters are often dismissed or they're not taken as seriously by scholars. And I think this has much to do with the constructed binary between the public and the private and the gendering of these two spheres. So the world of work and politics is the space of men versus the world of the home, family, domestic arrangements as the space of women. And of course, this is a problem that feminist historians have been grappling with and challenging for quite some time now. In this regard, I find Antoinette Burton's book, Dwelling in the Archive, particularly interesting. She asked this question of whether it's possible to use the home as an archive from which to write and understand political history. And she asked this question of whether private memories of the home can serve as evidence of political history. She argues, in fact, that they can. And then she explores this question and shows how, by looking at the writings of 3 20th century Indian women and how they made use of memories of home in their writing and discourse to engage with the public world of Indian nationalist politics and power. So I think the centering of these letters in this archive really provides scope to begin rethinking how public and private histories connect and how the private can be used to write different kinds of histories, including political and intellectual histories. And finally, I think for me, the third and final dimension of the richness of this archive lies in the wonderful collection of photographs, all 212 of them. And I just now want to share one of particularly struck by. I think I will need to share my screen quickly. Let me do that. And then let me pull up my PowerPoint. Can you guys see my screen? Let me put a slideshow on.
Yes.
Everyone see? Okay, yeah. So I love this photo of Dan Twala in the river with his friends. I think it really sort of captures the spontaneous moment of joy. And also you can almost sort of feel the freshness of the water. Wendy Cox, in her work on Marie Kathleen Jeffrey's archive, emphasizes that archives can be places of feeling and sensory experience. And I certainly get a sort of sensory experience when I look at this this image. I get a sense of the kind of joy, the spontaneity of the moment, the coolness of the water. Likewise, I think you do get a sense of the deep feelings of both Regina and Dan Twala when you read their correspondence. And just to say as well that, you know, the archival turn itself has been followed by an effective turn, which centers emotion and feeling as a frame from which to write new kinds of histories. And I think, again, these letters are so rich in facilitating this. Finally, I also really love the way in which the letters and photographs talk to each other. So just to show you, I came across this wonderful image of Regina at the Phulela Institute in 1938. And you can see she's sitting down. It looks to me like she has pen and paper in her hand. You have the mountains in the background. And Joel, in your book, you do talk about her walking on the mountain and settling down in nature to write. And then you have this wonderful letter also in the archive, written in the same year from Phulela, Regina to Dan, and it's got this drawing of the mountain in the background. And I just loved it. I thought the letter and the photograph speak so beautifully to each other. So just briefly then to conclude, Samuel Mueller, Johann Firth, and Robert Froon suggest that one needs to think of the archive as a living organism. I'm sure this archive will continue to grow as more sources are added and additional contextualization is developed. And it will also grow as researchers engage with its sources and develop new scholarship. And of course, as much as we construct archives, our engagement with them also can change us profoundly as scholars. And this is, I suppose, part of this nature of this living organism of the archive. As well, we have to note that archives are shaped as much by what is in them as what is missing, in this instance, Twala's book manuscripts. But I feel this archive not only helps us to learn more about Twala's life, work, and world, but it equally encourages us to ask new questions about this life, work, and world and its marginalization, and ultimately to imagine new futures even as we orientate ourselves towards the past. I'm just going to stop sharing now. And thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Annie. Joe, I'm going to hand it over to you for your initial responses to Athambile and Annie, and then we can take some questions from the participants.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to Azizo, to Gabi, to Athambile, to Annie for these really stimulating, thoughtful sets of comments. And, you know, Annie, I was so kind of intrigued to see the Twala's drawing of the mountain in her letter and then the actual photograph of her sitting next to the mountain. And, you know, I know these letters and photographs very well. You know, I've gone over them intensively many times, and this is honestly the first time that I've ever seen that kind of visual resonance or mirror image. And it's so nice, it's so gratifying. I mean, this is exactly what happens when you open up a body of material to researchers' eyes and minds, that new connections are made that have just never occurred to you. So I'm really thrilled. I just wanted to return first. So Azizo, in his comments, he mentioned something about a classifying system that's already in place for the letters. And I think that's quite important. So the letters were given to the South African historian Tim Cousins in the mid-1970s, lent or given, it's sort of ambiguous. And Tim Cousins was planning on writing something about the Twalas. He never did. But he kept the archive in his personal home. Dan Twala, well, Regina had already died by this point. Dan Twala died in the 80s. And that is where the letters still were when I first interacted with them. And at some point, probably in the 70s, possibly even early 80s, Tim Cousins had been through the letters and done some kind of rough chronological classifying system where he tried to organize them according to date. And on the back of each letter, sometimes on the front, he put a pencil, number, and letter that kind of constituted a sort of order. So, you know, when Azizo started digitizing it, this was one of the really fundamental conversations we had, which is, you know, do we make sure that both the front and the back of the letter are captured? You know, the back has no content, no data other than this pencil marking by Tim Cousins with a letter and a number. And Azizo felt very strongly, and I completely agreed with him, that it was very important to capture everything in the digitization, because, you know, Cousins' numbering system, his chronology didn't always make sense, but we wanted to capture his ordering, his cataloging of the archive as in a moment in the life of the archive. And I think, Annie, this goes back to what you were saying about, you know, the archive is both about the content, the data in the archive, but it's also about the history of how the archiving happens, the choices about what's going to be archived, what's going to be discarded. So we wanted to be kind of as complete and comprehensive as possible and capture Cousin's sort of intervention as part of the archive. Hence the decision to scan and digitize not only the front, but also the reverse of each item. And again, like, you know, drilling down into this point about an archive is an act of knowledge production in its own right. You know, I think, Athambile, you were so kind of perceptive to notice, you know, the importance of place names, the importance of language. You know, 400 letters deal with Johannesburg, 10 deal with Durban. And I think I just wanted to reiterate that those are incredibly human interventions. You know, those numbers, the numbers of incidences of the word Johannesburg being repeated in the letters, that is a Stanford undergraduate going through the letters and counting them. And this is a Stanford undergraduate. I mean, about 5 undergrads worked in the archive over the last few years. These are American undergraduates. They speak no isiZulu. I don't think any of the undergraduates had ever been to South Africa. So they were reading the letters carefully. They were looking out for recurrences of names, words, places, so on and so on. But of course, their lenses and their eyes and what struck them and what stuck out to them and what they noticed were completely conditioned by their position as early 20-year-old American undergrads in an elite university in North America. So the metadata, far from being an objective record of what the archive says, is an interpretative lens about what stood out to you and struck, you know. Also said there are many stories that can be told about the archive. I'm sure if a team of researchers in Johannesburg combed over the archive, they could produce quite a different set of metadata. You know, different things would jump out to them, different things would strike them. They would notice different place names. You know, they would be much more sensitive to language. They may find that far from only being 192 letters that have some mention of an isiZulu word phrase, there are many more because they can read isiZulu and they notice these things. So I wanted to stress the sort of very contingent in-process nature of this project, that, you know, the metadata that this particular group of students have generated for these letters and photos is just one possible interpretation of the archive. And I really look forward to it being kind of worked on and gone over by people with different perspectives far more proximate to the South African reality that the Twalas were in. You know, I wanted to kind of return to this issue of kind of public, private, you know, obviously intimate love letters are kind of as private as you get. On the other hand, the Twalas were both very public people. And now, you know, their correspondence has been
Joe, we've lost you. Is it just me? Or others also can't hear?
Yeah, she's gone.
Oh, Joe.
Oh, you can't hear. Oh,
yeah,
no, sorry.
Hear you again. Perhaps just take off your video for bandwidth.
Okay, what was the last thing I said?
You were talking about the Twalas both being, have we lost her completely? Yep. I think we've lost her completely. Let's just wait for a minute to see if she rejoins. Apologies, colleagues. Yes, she is. I'm also gonna take my video off. I don't know if it's gonna make any difference, but Athambile and Annie, could you take your videos off? Joel, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, let's keep our videos off.
Okay, keep our videos
so
off.
that, yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the universe telling me to stop wittering on. So I can stop there, and it'd be
No, you were talking about this, you know, the private and public.
Yeah. I mean, just
and-
very briefly, you know, I think these are issues that the Twala themselves grappled with about the letters, what to keep, what to preserve. And, you know, again, back to this issue of there being different interventions in an archive, that the archive is being constantly made and remade and reproduced. The Twalas themselves were the first archivists. I mean, they were the ones who were making the decisions about letters to keep. Regina Twala would write letters to Dan and write on the top, "Please destroy," when they dealt with a sensitive topic. Obviously, he didn't destroy them because we have those letters in the archive. And they were constantly preoccupied with managing the boundary between public, private, what to show to the world, what was inappropriate. Sorry, let me just, I joined on my phone. Let me put that off. Let's see here. So I see the archiving that Azizo's done, that Gabby's done, that I've done, that the Stanford students have done. You know, it's just the sort of latest moment in the managing and the kind of production of knowledge around this archive. And you know, Dan Twala, I mean, as I mentioned, Regina died first. She died in the 60s. You know, Dan was the one who collected everything. And the fact that both sides of the correspondence are here, that means that Dan, you know, throughout their life, throughout their relationship, he made sure that Regina gave back to him all the letters that he'd written to her, and he kept them. So he was inventorying, managing, cataloging, storing, preserving their correspondence. And this act of giving them to a scholar is, I think, another piece of evidence that he had a really profound interest in the management and the archiving of their kind of documentary legacy. So you know, going back to Athambile's point about the ethics of kind of opening up to the world this very private collection of letters, I agree. I think it's very sensitive. I think it's very delicate. I do take heart from the fact that I think the opening up and the managing of the archive is a process that, you know, the Twalas themselves embarked upon in their lifetime. So yeah, I'll stop there, and it would be lovely to hear any questions or comments from anyone in the room.
Thank you very much, Joel. I'm going to open it up to the rest of the participants. If you can just put your hand up, or you can also put a question or comment to Joel in the chat. Let me see. I don't see any hands. Am I missing anything? Oh, here I see Ali Hlungwani. Ali, please go ahead.
Thank you. On my side, it's not a question. It's just a comment that though I haven't yet gone through the archive, but I found it quite interesting already, as I have come across the name of Dan Twala in my current work on Kabi Mngoma. I think they were both related, but they were also part of the Bantuman Social Center, with Kabi being a music teacher and a choral master. And I'm looking forward to pick up more beyond the interviews I've come across of Dan Twala reflecting on the relationship with the Kabi Mngoma family, Eskem Pahlele, and the people who were part of the cultural scene in Orlando in the 1950s. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Yes, you'll see the section in the Johannesburg Spaces also has a section on the Bantuman Social Center, including photographs.
And if I can just add, thank you so much for that comment, that, you know, they were both very interested in music, choral, choral singing, and that, you know, as you already know, the sports club as well as the social centre were really hubs for music production as well as sports production. And I think the names that you've mentioned are all names that show up in the archive, and I think they're just further examples of how partial and incomplete the sort of work of archiving and the extraction of the metadata for the purposes of the digital archive still is. I mean, there's so much more that can be gleaned and mined from this archive and sort of digitally drawn out and made visible in the way that right now only, you know, very few aspects, you know, of the metadata are kind of surfaced or made visible. So I really hope that you get something from this archive and it's useful for your work.
I see another hand
Ash,
up.
yeah, Ashley.
Yes, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much, Joel. Thanks everybody for your comments. They're really fantastic archive, and congratulations. My question is really about metadata. Obviously, I just wonder. You mentioned that the kind of classification system of cousins was not entirely adequate, and the potential of metadata. Do you have any ideas as to I mean, how one can kind of articulate a more complex or a more layered or a more rich seam of metadata for this material as it stands at the moment, Joel?
Thanks, Ashley. I mean, I should say Cousins, I think, was really only trying to pull out a kind of basic working chronology of the archive. He wasn't kind of trying to do anything other than that. And I mean, one of the frustrations about the letters is, you know, as is completely normal in letters, that they're not always dated, and that you have to read through these hundreds and hundreds of items to try and manually piece together the chronology by sort of following the strands of the story, and, you know, picking up events from prior events and so on. So again, the creation of the chronology is in itself an act of interpretation. I mean, you are piecing together, yes, I'll get you some milk. You are piecing together a story that's, you know, that's not left there always by the letter writers. I mean, I think the other thing that I find interesting about the metadata is that Stanford has this kind of application spotlight exhibit that is currently hosting the archive. And this is their way of kind of creating exhibits or displays of the large amount of digital material that they have stored in their sort of institutional digital repository. You know, one of the limitations, you know, maybe even frustrations of the Stanford platform is that it's ready-made. There's a template, it's one size fits all. So when you are kind of, you know, creating your metadata and when you're sort of fitting it into their system, they have these pre-formed categories and labels and sort of units of analysis, you know, language, place, date, for example. But, you know, as I kind of hope I've been making clear, I think those choices about what to use as your basic units of analysis are incredibly ideologically motivated, and of course, you know, reflect, you know, the place of Stanford, as I said, as a sort of Northern Hemisphere elite private university. I mean, I think there are other units of knowledge, there are other aspects of the metadata that may emerge and strike researchers working from a kind of global South perspective, for example. So, you know, actually, I don't think I have anything kind of particularly profound or helpful to say, just that, you know, my sense is that metadata is in itself an ideological intervention. It's always geographically situated. And that's the importance of not letting, you know, kind of Northern Hemisphere digital practices sort of set the pace, set the tune that everyone has to kind of follow along to, but that you have indigenous digital knowledge production projects that are sort of being led by global South categories. But yeah, I know these are things that you're thinking about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Thank you,
so much,
Joel.
Joel. Thank you.
There's a comment from Zoe Groves in the chat. I don't know if you can see it, Joel, or would you like me to read it to you?
Ariane, I can see it. Thank you. It's great. And
Okay,
I have to
great.
say that thank you, Zoe. And I have to say that my hope is that this will be used for teaching and that students will be able to engage with the archive. And actually, my colleague at the University of Johannesburg, Natasha Erlang, she and I have a plan to hopefully collaboratively teach an undergraduate class between UJ and Stanford, where teams of students work with each other to kind of create new iterations of metadata. So I think there's a lot of scope, a lot of potential for teaching with this archive. And I'm so glad to hear that Zoe's planning on engaging with it with her students.
Thank you, Joel. Annie and Athambile and Azizo, Gabi, I don't know if there's anything else you would like to raise at this point.
No, Ariane, I think we're good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No, I'm just excited to share this with my students. Thank you.
Yeah, me too. I think this discussion is going to be ongoing, and once we start talking about, the archives, there is so much that can be said.
Thanks, everyone. Joel, do you have any concluding remarks to make?
Yeah, just thank you to everyone for coming. Thank you to Ariana for organizing this, to the Wits History Workshop for hosting, to my colleagues, Gabi, Azizo, Annie, Athambile for speaking about this, and just, happy reading and happy browsing, everyone. I hope you get a lot out of it. I did want to say there's a tab where on the kind of digital archive where you can leave feedback and comments. So if you discover errors, typos, mistakes in labels, captions that are given to material, if you notice discrepancies between the actual content of a letter and the metadata of the letter, and I know for sure there are errors, please reach out to me, because this is a work in progress and we're constantly refining and working upon and hopefully improving the archive. So please treat it as a work in progress. And you are all the kind of co-editors of the archive. So reach out with any comments or suggestions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Joel. And just a reminder to everyone that if they want to find out more about Regina Twala, they should also get hold of a copy of your book, Written Out, which is published in South Africa by Wits University Press. But yes, congratulations to you and to the team at Historical Papers and the Wits Digitization Center on a really fantastic resource for all of us. This is a great project, and thank you. It's been lovely to host you and to host the launch.
Thank you so much, Ariana, and yeah, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
And thank you, and thanks to Athambile, Annie, Azizo, and Gabi for participating. Thanks to everyone. I'll put up the recording of this webinar on the History Workshop YouTube page, so you'll find it there.
Fantastic.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Ariana.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.